Seattle wore its November rain like a second skin, the kind of persistent drizzle that didn't soak you through immediately, but settled into your bones over hours, making everything feel damp and heavy. Evan Miller stood at his apartment window on Capitol Hill, watching the blurred headlights crawl through the grey afternoon, each car a distant world moving through the mist. The city hummed below, with its usual rhythm of coffee shops, tech workers, and the endless churn of people who existed together but rarely truly connected. At 28, Evan had become exactly what he'd always feared: invisible in a crowd, notable only in spreadsheets. His studio apartment reflected the minimalism of someone who'd stopped trying to impress anyone, including himself. A desk dominated one corner, 3 monitors glowing with cascading data streams from his job at a mid-tier analytics firm downtown. The rest of the space held only essentials: a narrow bed, a kitchenette he barely used, and shelves lined with books he'd read multiple times, because new ones required energy he didn't have. The walls were bare except for water stains that looked like continents he'd never visit. Evan had moved to Seattle 3 years ago with vague dreams about the tech industry and reinvention, but the city had simply absorbed him. One more transplant, slowly realizing that geography couldn't fix what was broken inside. He refreshed Reddit for the 40th time that hour, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the mechanical keyboard. The site had become his primary form of human interaction, which he recognized as pathetic, but couldn't seem to change. His main haunt was a confessions subreddit with over 2 million subscribers, a digital confessional where people purged their darkest secrets behind throwaway accounts and anonymous avatars. Evan told himself he read them to understand human psychology, to feel less alone in his own quiet desperation. But truthfully, he'd become addicted to the raw honesty that people only seemed capable of when they believed no one could identify them. That Tuesday afternoon, a new post appeared that made his coffee go cold in his hand. The username was a random string of numbers and letters, freshly created, with 0 post history. The title read, "I know what you did in Portland, and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." The post itself contained a detailed account of a hit-and-run accident that had occurred 3 nights earlier in downtown Portland, describing the victim's final moments with disturbing specificity. The writer claimed to have witnessed everything from a nearby building, to have recorded video evidence, and to be slowly releasing clues that would lead authorities to the driver. But what chilled Evan was the almost gleeful tone, as if the confessor wasn't seeking justice, but savoring power. Evan clicked through to the news, searching Portland accidents from that weekend. Nothing, no reports, no mentions, no missing persons matching the description. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that had been plaguing him for months, the feeling that reality was slightly out of focus. His therapist, whom he'd stopped seeing because insurance made it impossible and talking made it worse, had called it anxiety. Evan called it recognition, the understanding that something was fundamentally wrong with how he experienced the world, but lacking the vocabulary or courage to name it. He saved the post, adding it to a folder he'd been maintaining for 3 weeks. Other confessions filled it, each one disturbing in its own right. There was the schoolteacher in Tampa who claimed to be slowly poisoning a colleague over a perceived slight, documenting each dose with scientific precision. The Austin man who discovered his wife's affair and was systematically destroying her life while maintaining the facade of a loving husband. The Chicago mother who'd abandoned her autistic son at a rest stop and driven away, starting a new life in Milwaukee. Each confession was detailed, specific, and accompanied by dates, locations, and identifying details that should have made them traceable. But when Evan tried to verify them against news reports or police records, he found nothing. It was as if these events existed only in the confessions themselves, shared truths that occupied a strange space between reality and fiction. The rain intensified, drumming against the window with renewed urgency. Evan's phone buzzed with a Slack message from his manager asking about quarterly analytics reports. He ignored it, unable to tear his attention away from the screen. The comments section of the Portland Confession had already erupted, filled with the usual mixture of skepticism, moral outrage, and people trying to play detective. But buried among them was a comment from another new account that made Evan's stomach drop. Evan Miller from Seattle knows more than he's saying. Check his search history. His heart hammered. That was impossible. He'd been careful, always using incognito mode, never posting anything himself. Yet there was his name, his city, staring back at him from a stranger's comment on a post about a crime that might not even be real. His hands trembled as he refreshed the page, but the comment was already gone, deleted or removed, leaving only the ghost of its notification in his inbox. Evan stood abruptly, the desk chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer, the city outside transformed from indifferent to hostile. He grabbed his rain jacket without thinking, needing to move, to be anywhere but alone with those glowing screens and the terrible certainty that he'd stumbled onto something that knew he was watching. The street outside was exactly as wet and grey as expected, Seattle in late autumn performing its perpetual impression of melancholy. Evan walked without destination, hands shoved deep in pockets, hood pulled up against the rain. The neighborhood was quiet this time of day, caught between lunch and evening. Most people still trapped in offices or apartments, just like his. He passed the usual landmarks: the coffee shop where baristas knew orders but not names, the vintage clothing store with impossibly hip employees, the community center with its faded mural about unity and belonging. None of it felt real anymore, all of it just backdrop for lives being lived somewhere else, by people who still believed they mattered. His phone buzzed again. Against his better judgment, Evan pulled it out, shielding the screen from the rain. A direct message on Reddit from yet another new account. "You're asking the right questions, Evan, but you're not ready for the answers. Not yet. Keep watching. Something special is coming." The message included no additional context, no explanation for how they knew his name or what questions they meant. But attached was a single photograph that made Evan's throat close. It was his apartment building, taken from across the street, time-stamped just 20 minutes ago. While he'd been inside, someone had been outside, watching. Harper Lee's brownstone in Brooklyn Heights had survived everything New York could throw at it for 140 years, but lately, even its stubborn architecture seemed to sag under the weight of the times. She sat at her grandmother's antique writing desk, the one piece of furniture she'd insisted on keeping after the estate sale, surrounded by the detritus of modern journalism. 3 laptops at various stages of dying, stacks of printed articles bleeding highlighter marks, and 17 coffee mugs in states of abandonment that documented the past week's irregular sleep schedule. Outside, the Sunday morning quiet was deceptive, Brooklyn holding its breath before the week crashed in. Harper had been awake for 36 hours, riding the specific kind of exhaustion that made words shimmer and thoughts crystallize into something approaching clarity. The email had arrived at 2:17 a.m., sent from a Proton Mail address that would be untraceable, she knew before even trying. The subject line simply read, "For the reporter who cares," which should have sent it straight to trash, alongside the other anonymous tips that filled her inbox daily. But Harper had learned to trust her instincts, that electric prickle at the base of her skull that separated genuine leads from conspiracy theories and attention seekers. This email felt different. It contained no manifesto, no rambling accusations, just a simple message. Check UU Throwaway Confessions 4471. Someone's been documenting real crimes before they're reported. You're the only one who'll understand why that matters. Harper had built her reputation on stories others avoided, the ones that required months of work for articles that made people uncomfortable and rarely went viral. At 32, she'd published investigative pieces on pharmaceutical company malfeasance, housing discrimination in gentrifying neighborhoods, and the systematic failure of child protective services in 3 states. Her apartment walls were decorated with framed articles and a Polk Award she'd won at 27 for exposing corruption in New York's foster care system. But that same wall also held a reminder of why she now worked freelance. A New York Times byline from 4 years ago, the article that had destroyed her career there and sent her into a spiral that took 18 months to climb out of. She'd published a story about sexual harassment in a prominent tech startup based on testimony from 8 women. The reporting had been solid, every source verified, every claim documented. But the company's legal team had been better prepared than she'd anticipated, and when one source recanted under pressure, the entire edifice collapsed. The Times settled, Harper was let go, and for months afterward, her name was synonymous with journalistic overreach. The women who'd been telling the truth were buried under the fallout. Harper learned that being right wasn't enough if you couldn't protect your sources, and that some truths were too expensive to tell. She'd rebuilt, slowly, carefully, taking only stories she could control completely, trusting no one's infrastructure but her own. The Reddit account led her down a rabbit hole that consumed the next 14 hours. The confessions were extraordinary, not for their sensationalism, but for their specificity. They read like police reports written by perpetrators, clinical in detail, while somehow conveying the confessor's emotional state. Harper started cross-referencing, pulling news reports from the past month, looking for patterns. The Chicago mother who'd abandoned her son, a missing child report had been filed 2 days after the confession appeared, matching every detail. The Tampa teacher, local news, mentioned a sudden faculty illness, a popular teacher hospitalized with organ failure, investigators calling it suspicious. The pattern held across 15 confessions she could verify, each one appearing online 24 to 72 hours before any official report. Harper's journalistic training screamed coincidence, confirmation bias, the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. But her instinct, that same prickle that had saved her career before it almost destroyed it, insisted otherwise. Someone was posting these confessions before the crimes became public knowledge. Either the confessor was the perpetrator, which raised questions about motive and the strange timeline, or someone else had advanced knowledge of multiple crimes across different states, which raised even darker questions. The third possibility, the one she barely let herself consider, was that someone was orchestrating these events specifically to be confessed online, turning real violence into content, human suffering into narrative. She drafted an email to her editor at The Atlantic, where she'd been placing longer investigative pieces, then deleted it. Too early, too speculative, too many holes. Harper had learned the hard way that bringing a half-formed story to an editor meant losing control of it, watching as it got assigned to someone with a bigger byline or got killed for being too risky. This one she'd develop alone until it was bulletproof. She created a secure cloud folder, began building a timeline, and sent out feelers to her network. Cops who owed her favors, tech industry sources who understood Reddit's back end, psychologists who specialized in confessional behavior. Each message was carefully vague, asking questions without revealing the full scope of what she was investigating. By evening, Harper had 17 responses and one that changed everything. A data analyst in Seattle named Evan Miller had been tracking the same confessions, building his own database, noticing the same impossible timeline. His message was formal, almost stiff, like someone unaccustomed to reaching out. "I'm not a journalist or investigator. I'm just someone who noticed something wrong and can't stop looking. I think these confessions are connected. I think someone's watching the people who read them. I think I might be in danger, and I don't know who else to tell." Attached was a photograph of his apartment building, clearly taken by someone else, and a screenshot of a threatening Reddit message that named him directly. Harper felt the familiar rush, part fear and part excitement, the sensation of standing at the edge of something significant. She responded immediately, her fingers flying across the keyboard faster than her caution could intervene. "Evan, my name is Harper Lee. I'm an investigative journalist in New York. I've been tracking these confessions too. You're not crazy, and you're not alone. We need to talk, but not here. Give me a secure email or a phone number. And Evan, be careful who you trust, including me. If someone's watching you, they're watching everyone who gets close to this." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then stood and walked to the window. Brooklyn stretched out below, millions of lives intersecting and diverging, everyone carrying secrets they'd never voice, except maybe late at night, behind anonymous usernames in digital spaces where confession felt safe. Harper thought about the women she'd tried to protect 4 years ago, how exposure had destroyed them even when they were telling the truth. She thought about all the truths that lived only in darkness because bringing them to light meant burning everything down. And she thought about whoever was orchestrating these confessions, turning human darkness into performance, and wondered what kind of person could hold that much pain and not collapse under its weight. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is Evan. I got your message. I'm afraid to use my regular phone. I'm afraid to stay home. I'm afraid that noticing this made me part of it somehow. Can we talk tomorrow? I need to know I'm not losing my mind." Harper saved the number, her heart rate elevated in the way that meant a story was real, that meant stakes and danger and the possibility of mattering again. She texted back, "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Grand Central Terminal, main concourse, come alone. Look for a woman with a red scarf reading the Times. And Evan, you're not losing your mind, but what we're looking at might be worse than that." Grand Central Terminal on a Monday afternoon was organized chaos, thousands of commuters flowing through the marble concourse with practiced urgency, everyone knowing exactly where they needed to be and how little time they had to get there. Harper arrived early, positioning herself near the information booth where she could see all entrances, the red scarf bright against her black coat. She'd chosen this location deliberately, public enough to be safe, crowded enough to disappear into, architecturally significant enough that she'd remember every detail if she needed to later. The old journalist's habit of treating every meeting like it might need to be reconstructed for an article or a deposition. Evan appeared at exactly 2 p.m., which Harper noted as either promising professionalism or concerning rigidity. He was taller than she'd imagined from his message, with the kind of posture that suggested he was trying to take up less space than he occupied. His eyes scanned the crowd with visible anxiety, hands shoved in the pockets of a rain jacket that looked more Seattle than New York. When their eyes met, there was a moment of recognition that felt almost visceral, like two people who'd been swimming in the same dark water finally finding each other. He approached cautiously, and Harper stood, extending her hand in a gesture that felt absurdly formal given the circumstances. "Harper?" His voice was quiet enough that she had to lean in to hear over the terminal's ambient roar. "Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up." There was something heartbreaking in his gratitude, the relief of someone who'd been convinced he was alone. Harper gestured toward the exit, and they walked together toward Lexington Avenue, falling into step naturally. She'd learned that serious conversations happened better in motion, walking side by side rather than face to face, giving people the space to talk without the pressure of constant eye contact. They found a coffee shop 3 blocks away, the kind of anonymous chain that existed in every city, offering nothing memorable except reliable Wi-Fi and the protective cover of strangers who wouldn't remember seeing them. Harper ordered for both of them, while Evan secured a corner table far from windows, his back against the wall. Military training or paranoia, she wondered, or maybe just the instinct of someone who'd learned the world was watching. When she returned with their drinks, He had his laptop open, a spreadsheet filling the screen with dates, usernames, and brief descriptions of confessions that made Harper's stomach tighten. "I've documented 47 confessions that follow the pattern," Evan began, his voice gaining confidence as he moved into the familiar territory of data. "Each one appears between 24 and 96 hours before any official report of the incident. I've cross-referenced with police databases, news aggregators, and missing persons reports across 17 states. The correlation is statistically impossible to dismiss. Someone is either committing these crimes or has advanced knowledge of them, and they're using Reddit as a platform for, I don't know what, public confession, psychological terrorism, a game." Harper pulled out her own laptop, opening her research folder. "I've got 31 documented different methodology, but similar conclusions. What concerns me more is the escalation pattern. The early confessions, going back about 3 months, were relatively minor: theft, vandalism, fraud. But in the last month, they've become increasingly violent. The hit and run in Portland, the poisoning in Tampa, and as of yesterday, a post claiming responsibility for a house fire in Denver that killed 3 people. The Denver fire happened Saturday night. The confession appeared Sunday morning, 6 hours before firefighters even determined it was arson." Evan's face went pale, his fingers frozen above his keyboard. "I haven't seen that one." "Which subreddit?" Harper showed him, watching as he navigated to the post and read it with mounting horror. The confession was written in the same clinical style as the others, describing the preparation, the execution, the moment of standing across the street watching the flames take hold while a family slept inside. But this one included something new, a dedication. "For Evan and Harper," it read, "who've been paying such close attention. Thank you for watching. You're making this meaningful." The coffee shop seemed to contract around them, the ambient noise of espresso machines and casual conversations suddenly distant and unreal. Harper felt the old sensation from 4 years ago, the moment when a story stopped being abstract and became personal, dangerous, unavoidable. Evan was breathing shallow and fast, the kind of hyperventilation that preceded panic. She reached across the table and touched his hand, grounding him with physical contact, and her voice kept deliberately calm. "Evan, look at me. Breathe. We're in a public place. You're safe right now. But we need to figure out our next move, and I need you present and thinking clearly." He nodded, forcing deeper breaths, his analytical mind visibly fighting for control over his fear. "They know we're investigating. They've known since I started tracking these posts. That message outside my apartment, the comment that named me directly, they've been watching the whole time. But why? If they wanted to hurt us, they could have already. If they wanted to stop us from investigating, threatening us would just confirm we're onto something. So what do they actually want?" Harper had been asking herself the same question since receiving that initial anonymous email. "Audience," she said slowly, the theory crystallizing as she spoke. "They want us to witness, to document, to give their confessions credibility. Think about it. Reddit is full of creative writing exercises pretending to be confessions. But if real journalists and data analysts are tracking them, correlating them with actual crimes, then they become something more. They're not just posts, they're evidence, they're real. We're validating them by investigating." "So we stop," Evan said immediately. "We walk away, delete everything, let it disappear into the noise of the internet. Without validation, without investigation, they're just another anonymous account posting disturbing content." But even as he said it, Harper could see he didn't believe it was possible. Neither did she. That was the genius of the trap. They couldn't ignore what they'd seen, couldn't unknow the pattern, couldn't accept that people were being hurt while they remained silent. The confessor hadn't just predicted their investigation. They'd engineered it, understanding exactly the type of people who would notice and be unable to look away. Harper closed her laptop, decision made. We don't stop. We accelerate. Whoever this is wants to play games with confession and attention, fine, but we change the rules. Instead of reacting to their posts, we get ahead of them. We find the pattern behind the pattern, how they're choosing victims, how they're getting advance information, what connects these crimes beyond the confessions. And we publish everything, bring in law enforcement, make it public enough that they can't control the narrative anymore. Evan's expression shifted through several emotions: fear, doubt, and then something that looked almost like relief. You understand this will probably destroy us, right? If we're wrong, we look like conspiracy theorists. If we're right, we're exposing ourselves to someone who's already demonstrated they know how to find us and isn't afraid of consequences. My therapist would have a field day with the fact that I'm even considering this. I had a career destroyed once already, Harper said, surprised by how easy it was to admit. Published a story that was true, but I couldn't prove conclusively enough. Lost my job, my reputation, watched sources get buried under legal threats, spent 2 years rebuilding. And you know what I learned? Being safe is its own kind of death. Not the dramatic kind, just the slow erosion of everything that makes you feel alive. So yes, I understand the risks. And I'm in anyway. The question is whether you are. They looked at each other across the coffee shop table. Two strangers united by the terrible intimacy of shared danger. And Harper saw the moment Evan made his choice. It was visible in his posture, the way his shoulders squared and his breathing steadied, the transformation from victim to participant. I'm in, he said quietly, but I need to know, what's our actual first move? Because tracking posts reactively hasn't worked. They're always ahead of us. Harper pulled out a notebook, the old-fashioned kind, with actual paper, harder to hack than any digital device. We build a profile, not of the crimes, but of the confessor. What do these confessions tell us about who's writing them? What psychological needs are they fulfilling? What do they gain beyond just committing the crimes? Then we use that profile to predict what they'll do next. And when they do it, we're there, documenting everything, building a case that's too solid to dismiss or threaten away. Over the next 3 hours, they worked together with the synchronized intensity of people who'd found their perfect collaborator. Evan's analytical precision complemented Harper's narrative intuition, his spreadsheets organizing the chaos she naturally saw in patterns and stories. They identified commonalities. The confessions were always detailed, but emotionally detached, suggesting someone intelligent and controlled. The crimes escalated in severity, but maintained similar methodological precision, indicating planning rather than impulsive violence. And most tellingly, the confessor needed an audience, needed validation, needed to transform private acts into public narrative. That vulnerability, that need to be witnessed, was where they'd find their opening. As evening fell and the coffee shop began closing, they'd compiled something approaching a psychological profile and a plan. Harper would reach out to her FBI contacts, carefully, feeling out whether there was any official investigation into these confessions. Evan would continue data analysis, but expand it, looking for patterns in the timing, geography, and victim selection that might predict the next confession. And they'd set up secure communications, assuming every message was potentially monitored, every meeting potentially observed. The paranoia felt theatrical, until Harper remembered the photograph of Evan's apartment, the dedication in the Denver confession, and realized they weren't being paranoid enough. They left separately, Harper heading back to Brooklyn while Evan caught a cab to JFK for a red-eye back to Seattle. Before they parted, Harper stopped him with a question that had been nagging since they met. Evan, why did you reach out to me specifically? How did you even know I was investigating this? He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I searched for journalists who'd covered similar stories. Your name came up connected to that harassment investigation 4 years ago. I read about what happened, how you lost your job trying to protect sources. I figured if anyone would understand not being able to look away from something dangerous, it would be you. Harper felt something break open in her chest, emotion she'd kept carefully controlled for years. That story destroyed me, Evan. I got it right, and it still cost me everything. He met her eyes with unexpected directness. Yeah, he said simply, but you got it right. That matters. That has to matter. Then he was gone, disappearing into New York's evening crowd, leaving Harper standing alone on a street corner, feeling more exposed and more alive than she had in years, committed now to a story that would either redeem her or finish what her last investigation had started. The next 72 hours unfolded with the dreamlike intensity of inevitable disaster. Harper's FBI contact, a field agent named Martinez, who'd helped on her foster care investigation, agreed to meet off the record at a diner in Queens that smelled like fryer grease and institutional coffee. He listened to her pitch with the expression of someone trying to be polite while mentally calculating the quickest exit. When she finished, Martinez sighed and stirred his coffee with deliberate slowness, choosing words carefully. Harper, I'm going to tell you this as a friend, not as bureau. What you're describing sounds like either confirmation bias or someone very carefully feeding you a narrative. Anonymous online confessions aren't evidence, they're stories. Even if they correlate with real crimes, correlation isn't causation. You're seeing patterns because that's what journalists do, but that doesn't mean there's actually a coordinated perpetrator. Harper had expected skepticism, but still felt the sting of dismissal. So, if I brought you 47 documented instances of confessions appearing before crimes were reported, you wouldn't investigate. Martinez's expression shifted to something approaching sympathy. I'd look at it, sure. But I'd also look at your track record, Harper, and I'd remember what happened last time you chased a story this hard. The Bureau doesn't have resources to investigate theories. We investigate evidence, and anonymous internet posts aren't evidence, they're noise. He left money for his untouched coffee and paused before walking out. Be careful. The story that feels most important is usually the one that blinds you to what you're missing. Back in Brooklyn, Harper found 17 new emails from Evan, each one documenting new connections, new patterns, new confessions that fit their emerging profile. His messages had the manic quality of someone who hadn't slept, thoughts cascading faster than he could organize them. But buried in the data dumps was something significant. He'd identified a geographic pattern. The confessions originated from accounts that, while using VPNs and anonymization tools, showed subtle location tells in their posting times and linguistic patterns. They clustered around 5 cities: Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, Chicago, and Atlanta. Not the crimes themselves, which happened everywhere, but the confessions, which seemed to be written from these specific locations. Harper called Evan on the secure line they'd established, hearing his exhaustion immediately in his voice. I've been analyzing metadata for 18 hours straight, he said without preamble. The confessions are being posted by someone who moves between these 5 cities regularly, probably for work. Business traveler, consultant, someone with reason to be mobile but structured about it. And Harper, I think they're escalating again. There's a new post from this morning, different subreddit but same style. They're claiming they're going to commit a crime in New York, specifically Manhattan, within the next 48 hours, and they've dedicated it to you by name. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, Brooklyn's familiar safety transformed into vulnerability. Harper pulled the post up on her laptop, reading with mounting dread. For Harper Lee, who thinks she can expose the darkness by documenting it. Let's see how commitment to truth holds up when it's personal. Tomorrow night, Manhattan. Someone you've never met will die because you're paying attention. Their blood will be on your conscience. Proof that witnessing makes you complicit. You're not investigating me, Harper. You're collaborating with me. Every article you write, every connection you make public, you're giving my confessions immortality. You're making me matter. Harper's hands shook as she closed the laptop. This was different from the Denver dedication, more direct, more threatening, specifically targeting her role as journalist and witness. The confessor understood exactly what would hurt most. The implication that her investigation was enabling violence, that seeking truth was causing harm. It was a perfect psychological trap, exploiting the guilt she already carried from the harassment story, the sources she'd failed to protect. If she backed away, she abandoned both the investigation and whatever victim was being threatened. If she continued, she accepted the confessor's framing that she was somehow responsible for their actions. "Evan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I think we need to go to the police. Not the FBI, not Martinez, but NYPD. If there's a credible threat against someone in Manhattan, they'll have to take it seriously." But even as she said it, she knew the problem. The confession was too vague. No specific victim, no specific method, no actionable intelligence. The police would file a report and tell her to be careful, and then someone would die, and the confessor would post proof that they'd kept their promise, and Harper would spend the rest of her life knowing she could have prevented it if only she'd been smarter, faster, better at her job. That night Harper didn't sleep, monitoring the confession subreddits obsessively while simultaneously researching the 5 cities Evan had identified, looking for any connection that made sense. Around 3 a.m., delirious with exhaustion, she found it. All 5 cities had hosted a specific conference series over the past 6 months, a professional development event for healthcare industry data analysts. The conferences had occurred at exactly the intervals between confession clusters, suggesting someone whose travel was tied to these events. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread, something to pull that might unravel everything. She called Evan, waking him from what sounded like his first sleep in days. "Healthcare data analysts," she said without preamble. "That's the profession we're looking for. Someone with access to hospital records, police reports, coroner's reports, all the data that would let them know about crimes before they become public. And someone whose job involves traveling between these specific cities for conferences." Evan was quiet for several seconds, processing. "That's brilliant and also terrifying, because if you're right, they have access to massive amounts of personal information. Medical records, mental health histories, insurance claims. They could identify victims, predict crimes, maybe even orchestrate situations that lead to the confessions they're making." The sun rose over Brooklyn while they talked, Harper watching her neighborhood transform from night to day through her window, normal people beginning normal routines, while she and Evan planned how to catch someone who turned human suffering into performance art. They decided Harper would attend the next healthcare data conference, scheduled for Phoenix in 2 weeks, using press credentials to gain access, while Evan monitored online activity for any confessions that appeared during that window. It was a long shot, maybe a desperate one, but it was the first time they'd had a proactive plan, rather than just reacting to confessions after they appeared. But first, they had to survive the next 48 hours and whatever the Manhattan confession threatened. Harper spent Tuesday in motion, visiting precincts, talking to detectives, trying to convince someone that an anonymous online post represented credible danger. The responses ranged from sympathetic dismissal to outright suspicion of her motives. One detective in Midtown asked pointedly if she was trying to create news rather than report it, implying that her presence might be part of an elaborate hoax. By evening, Harper was back in her apartment, defeated and terrified, watching the clock tick toward the confessor's deadline. At 11:47 p.m., her phone rang, unknown number. She answered without thinking, hearing Evan's voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Harper, there's a new post. They just published it. They're claiming they committed the crime an hour ago. Murray Hill, apartment building on East 36th Street. They say they set a fire in a 4th-floor unit while the resident was asleep. And Harper, they posted your address in the comments before deleting it. They want you to know they know exactly where you are." Harper was already moving, grabbing her laptop and bag, heading for the door. She called 911 while running down the stairs, reporting the fire address from Evan's message, and then caught a cab to Manhattan. The drive across the Brooklyn Bridge felt surreal, the city lights reflecting off the East River, while emergency sirens wailed in the distance, converging on Murray Hill. By the time she arrived, 3 fire trucks were on scene, firefighters emerging from the building carrying someone on a stretcher, paramedics working frantically. Harper showed her press credentials to a police officer, getting as close as they'd allow, and watched as they loaded the victim into an ambulance. A firefighter nearby was talking to another officer. Victims alive but critical. Looks like an accelerant was used, started in the kitchen while she was sleeping in the bedroom. Door was jammed from outside, windows sealed. She got out through sheer luck, woke up to the smoke alarm and broke through the door. Another 5 minutes and she'd be dead. Harper felt everything crystallize into terrible clarity. The confessor had followed through on their threat, had attempted murder to prove their power over the investigation, to demonstrate that they could kill and confess, and Harper's awareness wouldn't stop them, would only make her complicit. She spent the rest of the night at the hospital where the victim, a 34-year-old graphic designer named Michelle Torres, was being treated for smoke inhalation and burns. Harper sat in the waiting room, writing notes she'd probably never use, trying to process what had happened. The confessor had escalated to attempted murder with Harper as the stated audience, framing her investigation as catalyst rather than prevention. Every instinct said to walk away, delete everything, disappear back into freelance obscurity. But Michelle Torres was alive only by chance, and whoever had targeted her would target someone else, and walking away meant accepting that truth was less important than safety. At dawn, Evan arrived at the hospital, looking even more exhausted than Harper felt. They sat together in plastic chairs, while nurses moved efficiently through morning routines and spoke in quiet voices about impossible choices. "We can't stop," Evan said finally, and Harper realized he'd come to the same conclusion. Not because we're heroes or because we're particularly brave, but because we've seen enough to know this person will continue, regardless of whether we investigate. The only question is whether we try to stop them or let them disappear back into anonymity. Harper nodded, feeling the decision settle into her bones. Phoenix conference in 2 weeks. We go together, both of us, and we don't just observe, we engage. We find the people who fit our profile and we push until something breaks. And Evan, when this is over, win or lose, I'm writing everything. Your involvement, my involvement, all of it. Because if we're going to be made complicit, we're going to make damn sure everyone understands we were trying to stop this, not enable it. They left the hospital together as Michelle Torres was upgraded to stable condition, walking out into New York morning sunshine that felt inappropriate somehow, too normal for the gravity of what they'd committed to. Harper thought about Martinez's warning, about being blinded by the story that felt most important. She thought about the harassment investigation and all the ways seeking truth had made things worse. And she thought about the confessor, somewhere in America, watching their reactions, planning the next move in a game where the rules kept changing and the stakes kept rising. The final Reddit post appeared that afternoon, visible for only minutes before being deleted, but screenshot and saved by dozens of observers. "Harper and Evan, you've accepted the invitation. Phoenix in 2 weeks. I'll be waiting, hidden among hundreds of people who share my profession but not my calling. You'll interview, investigate, profile, and maybe you'll even find me. But here's what you don't understand yet. I'm not afraid of being caught. I'm afraid of being forgotten. You've given me exactly what I needed. Witnesses, documentation, proof that what I confess matters. Thank you for that. Thank you for making me real."